When Walt Hargrove died in the back booth of his own diner at 71 years old, his two children divided what he left behind in 9 days. The house on Pratt Street sold in a week. The savings were split before the funeral home sent its final bill. His son Cole took everything a person could turn into money. His daughter Della took the thing nobody wanted. A closed-down diner on Route 9 with a tarp over half the roof, 3 card boxes of what her brother called junk, and a ring of keys to a building the county had nearly condemned. She had $187 in her checking account, and a chef's knife she had not unwrapped in 4 months. On a gray Tuesday morning in late October, she finally drove out to clean the place and sell whatever the salvage company would haul. Under the floor of the pantry, bolted flush against the concrete and painted the same dull gray, was a steel box no contractor had ever installed. And what Walt Hargrove had sealed inside it was something neither of his children knew existed. 9 days earlier, Della had stood in the kitchen of the house, where she grew up, and watched her brother fold packing tape over a box of their father's clothes. He worked the way a man works when he is moving, not grieving. Cole had the estate agent out the morning after the burial, a woman in a navy blazer who measured rooms with a laser and talked about square footage while Walt's reading glasses still sat folded on the windowsill above the sink. Cole sealed another box and pressed the tape flat with his left thumb. He did not look up when he spoke. "House should move fast," he said. "Market's hungry out here right now. Dad's been gone 4 days and the property taxes don't care." "He's been gone 4 days, Cole." "I'm not being cold, I'm being the one who handles it. Somebody has to be." His wife Renee stood in the doorway scrolling her phone. She had come inside long enough to claim the oak hutch their mother loved, and a set of dishes that had been in the family since before Della was born. The rest, she said, was not worth the cost of renting a truck. Della watched the furniture go. The armchair where Walt fell asleep to the radio. The kitchen table where he ate the same breakfast for 40 years, 2 eggs over hard, white toast, coughed black as creek mud. The dresser with the warped drawer, where he kept a photograph of Della's mother tucked behind a deck of cards he never finished a game with after she died. Cole kept the truck, a 4-year-old half-ton he had been borrowing anyway. He kept the savings account, just under $19,000 after he claimed executor's fees and the cost of the headstone. He kept the tools from the garage and sold most of them to a man off a classified ad before Della knew they were gone. What he did not want was the diner. It sat out on Route 9 like something the highway had forgotten. A low brick building with a flat roof, a cracked front window, and a faded sign on a steel pole that read the lantern in letters that had once been read. "It's a liability," Cole said, dropping the keys on the counter beside the 3 boxes. "Roofs, shot. This guy said maybe $400 for the fixtures in the booths, but you'd have to clear it out yourself." He nudged the boxes toward her with his foot. "Dad's stuff from the place. Aprons, some old papers, a coffee can full of nothing. I went through it. There's nothing in there." Della picked up the keys. They were warm from his hand, hung on a brass ring, worn smooth, and the largest one had a strip of masking tape on it, gone soft and yellow, with front written in her father's careful block letters. "That's it?" she said. "That's it." She looked around the kitchen, half emptied already turning into somebody else's house. "I guess that's it," she said. The diner had been closed for almost a year by the time she drove out to it. Walt had kept it open until the week he couldn't stand for a full shift, and then he locked the door and never reopened. Though the regulars said he still came out most mornings, sat in the corner booth with a thermos he brought from home, and watched the road through the cracked glass. Della knew none of that yet. She knew only that the storage of a dead man's grief had landed on her, and that she had nowhere to put it, because her own life had no room left. Her apartment was 1 bedroom above a laundromat off Delmar in the city, 4 hours north. The radiator clanked but rarely warmed. The landlord had started taping notes to her door, polite at first, and then not. On her kitchen counter sat a stack of envelopes she had stopped opening, the failure of a restaurant folded inside each one. 14 months since she had cooked for anyone. 14 months since the night she stood in the dining room of a place called Marrow. The restaurant she had urged everything to open and told 11 employees there would be no more paychecks. The walk-in was full of food she had ordered for a Saturday that would not come. She handed her sous chef the keys and drove home and did not pick up a knife again. There had been a smaller failure first, one she never named out loud. The night her father had his first heart episode, 2 years before he died, she did not come. It was a Friday. The dining room was full. A critic was in the house, And she told herself he was stable, that her brother was there, that she would drive down Monday. She did not drive down Monday. The restaurant folded 6 weeks later anyway, and somewhere in that math was a number she could never make come out even. She had traded her father for a dream, and then she had lost the dream too. Now it was Tuesday, cold and overcast, and the diner sat waiting for her at the edge of a town she had spent her adult life driving away from. She parked her mother's old hatchback on the gravel apron and sat behind the wheel for 10 minutes, fuss before she could make herself get out. The salvage company opened at 9. If she could empty the place by then, she could let them strip it. Maybe clear $300, enough to keep the lights on in the city for another month, while she figured out what a person does when there is nothing left to figure out. She unlocked the front door. The brass bell above it gave a single dull note, and then the smell reached her, and she had to put a hand on the doorframe to steady herself. Bacon grease worked deep into the vents, burnt sugar, coffee, decades of it, soaked into the wood and the vinyl and the very air. And under all of it, something that was simply Walt, the way a person's smell lives in a place long after the person is gone. Della stood in the doorway and breathed it and did not move. The room was exactly as he'd left it. 6 booths along the windows, their red vinyl cracked and patched with tape. A counter with 8 stools, their chrome dull but standing. A pie case, empty now, its glass clouded. A chalkboard on the wall behind the counter, and on it, in her father's hand, the last thing he ever wrote there. Today, pot roast, cornbread, and whatever you need. She stared at that last word a long time before she understood she didn't understand it. Whatever you need was not a menu item. It was something else, and she had no idea what. She walked the length of the place, running her hand along the counter, feeling the grooves worn by 41 years of plates and elbows and coffee cups set down hard. The kitchen behind it was clean, far cleaner than a shuttered diner had any right to be. The flat top was wiped and oiled. The walk-in, when she opened it, was off but spotless. Someone had been keeping this kitchen, not casually, and her father had been dead a week. That was the first thing that didn't fit. She would find more before the morning was over, and one of them would change the shape of her life. In the corner, set apart from the others, was the booth her father had called Booth 6, though there were only 6 and the others had no numbers. The vinyl there was newer than the rest, replaced at some point with a patch that almost matched. On the wall beside it hung a framed photograph she had never seen. Walt as a young man in a paper hat, standing in front of the diner the day it opened, the sign behind him bright and new, his hand raised to shield his eyes from a sun that had set on that day half a century ago. He was smiling. Della could not remember the last time she had seen her father smile like that. She could not remember the last time she had bothered to look. She sat down in booth 6 because her legs had stopped wanting to hold her. The vinyl sighed under her. The window beside her was the cracked one, a single line running corner to corner door, sealed long ago with a strip of clear tape that had yellowed and curled. Through it she could see Route 9, empty in both directions, and across the road a low brick storefront with a hand-painted sign that read Renner Hardware and Feed. A light was on inside. Somebody over there was already awake and working, the way somebody always seemed to be in places like this, while the rest of the world slept on. Della pressed her palms flat on the table and let herself feel for 1 minute the full size of where she had ended up. 41 years old, a failed restaurant, an empty bank account, a father in the ground she had not properly spoken to in 2 years, and a brother who had handed her a building he called a liability and 3 boxes he called junk. She had come here to throw all of it away. She put her face in her hands. She did not cry. She had done her crying months ago, alone, and what she felt now was quieter than grief and emptier, the particular flatness of a person who has run out of even the energy to mourn. Then she got up because the salvage company opened at 9, and she went to empty the pantry. The pantry was a narrow room off the kitchen, lined with steel shelving, mostly bare now except for industrial cans of tomatoes and a 50-pound sack of flour gone hard as concrete. Della began pulling cans down and stacking them by the door. She worked the way she always worked, fast and without thinking, because thinking was the thing she could not afford. She had cleared 2 shelves when her foot caught on a seam in the floor. She looked down. The pantry floor was poured concrete, gray and unremarkable, except for one section near the back wall, about 2 feet by 3, where the gray was a slightly different shade, newer, edged by a faint line a careless eye would never catch. Della knelt down. She had spent enough years in restaurant kitchens to know what a floor was supposed to look like. And this was not it. Her fingers found a latch tucked against the baseboard, painted to vanish. Invisible, unless you were looking for it the way she was looking for it now. Her heart had started to do something it had not done in a long time. She worked the latch with her thumbnail. It resisted, then gave with a flat metallic click. A panel of concrete-faced steel lifted on a hinge, and underneath it was a box, welded directly to a frame set into the slab, about 8 inches deep and lined with a folded wool blanket so nothing inside would rattle. The things inside had not been thrown in. They had been placed there, arranged the way a person arranges what matters. Della lifted them out one at a time and set them on the pantry floor. 4 ledgers, the cloth-bound kind, their spines cracked from years of opening, their corners gone soft. A coffee can, an old Folgers can, the lid pressed on tight, heavier than a coffee can should be. A bundle of envelopes, dozens of them, bound with a length of kitchen twine, the paper at the bottom of the stack gone the color of weak tea. A passbook with a pale green cover stamped Hartwell Savings Bank. A manila envelope, thick, sealed with a lawyer's name printed on a label in the corner. And underneath everything, flat against the wool, a plain white envelope with a single word written across it in blue ink. In a hand she had known her whole life and had stopped reading the love in long ago. Della. She sat back on her heels with the envelopes, and the ledgers spread around her on the cold floor, and her hands were not steady. Outside, a truck downshifted on the highway and was gone, and the silence came back, and in the silence she could hear her own breathing. If you've come this far with Della into that pantry, stay with me, because everything that man hid under the floor is about to come up into the light, and none of it is what his children thought he was. She opened the passbook first because it was the thing she understood. The account was in Walt Hargrove's name. The first deposit was dated 31 years ago. $2. After that, the entries ran down the pages and on to the next and the next, a deposit nearly every week, never large. Sometimes $1, sometimes $3, once in a while a $5, never more. The final entry was made 9 days before he died, and the running balance beside it read $38,406. Della stared at the number until it stopped meaning anything. Her father had run a diner where the most expensive plate was $8.95. He had never owned a thing that wasn't dented. Cole had already emptied the only account anyone in the family knew about, $19,000 in the bank in town. This account had never been spoken of, built $1 at a time over 3 decades, a coffee can poured into a teller's window week after week after week. She opened the coffee can next. It was full of folded bills, 1s and 5s mostly, soft from handling, and a slip of paper on top in Walt's hand that read, "For the jar." So the next one eats. She did not know yet what the jar was. She set the can down carefully as if it might wake something. She opened the manila envelope. Inside was a deed. A property, the very building she was sitting in, lot and structure at the corner of Route 9 and Cutter Road, purchased 11 years ago for $26,500 cash. The buyer's name was Walter J. Hargrove. Della frowned at it. She had always assumed her father rented the diner, that it belonged to some landlord in town, the way it had when she was a girl. Below the deed, clipped to it, was a second sheet, a smaller adjacent lot bought the same day, and a handwritten note in Walt's script. Hauled in trust. C. Brandt and Cho. She had never heard of Brandt and Cho. She had not known her father owned the ground under his own feet. She picked up the white envelope with her name on it and turned it over. The back was blank. She slid her thumb under the flap and tore it open and pulled out 3 pages, folded in thirds, the writing steady at the top and looser by the end. "Dear Della," it began. "If you found the box, then I'm gone, and you're sitting in my pantry on a cold floor, wondering what your old man was up to all these years. That's a fair thing to wonder. I should have told you I wanted. But every time I tried to find the words, they came out sounding either foolish or like I was bragging, and the whole point was that it was never supposed to be either of those things. So I wrote it down instead, and I put it where only somebody willing to clean the place out herself would ever find it. I figured if you came out here to do the hard, ugly work of emptying it, then you were the one. You always were the one. You just had to lose enough to come back and see it." Della stopped. She read the next paragraph and her chest pulled tight. "You probably noticed the place is too clean for a man who's been dead a week. That's Gus across the road. He's kept the pilot light burning and the pipes from freezing every winter, since I got too old to climb the ladder. There's a light in the front window. I want you to leave it on. I've kept a light burning in that window every single night for 41 years, and I'll tell you why, because I never told anybody. Not even your mother. Not the whole of it. She turned to the ledgers then, because she had to. She opened the top one to a page near the middle, and her father's small, even handwriting filled it, dated entries, one after another. March 3rd, trucker no name came in at 2 a.m. soaked through, wallet stolen at a stop in Joplin. Fed him the meatloaf, gave him a thermos for the road and $40 from the jar. Said he'd mail it back. Told him not to bother, just to feed the next cold man he found. She turned the page, April 19th. The DOS girl again, 3 kids in the car, husband gone to find work in Tulsa and not sending anything. Fed them, packed a box of canned goods and bread, slipped 20 in the diaper bag where she wouldn't find it till later, so she wouldn't have to say no. She is too proud to take it from my hand. That's all right. Proud is just hurt that's standing up straight. Della flipped forward, then back, then forward again. Hundreds of entries, thousands. Each one dated, each one a person. A meal, a small quiet act her father had performed in the middle of the night when no one was watching and had told no one about, not his wife, not his children, not the regulars who sat at his counter every morning and thought they knew him. He had run a diner for 41 years, and somewhere in there he had also been running something else entirely, a thing with no name and no sign, and she was only now, at 41 years old, on her knees on his pantry floor, learning the first word of it. She went back to the letter. The light in the window is for a man named Earl Coombs, who I never met but think about most nights. The winter I was 26, my first year with this place, a man knocked on the locked door at midnight, half frozen, asking if I'd open up and make him something hot. I'd had a long day. I told him through the glass we were closed, come back at 6. He nodded like he understood and walked off down the shoulder of Route 9 into the dark. They found him the next morning 2 miles up the road, frozen, sat down against a fence post like he was just resting. Earl Coombs, 51, on his way to a brother in Springfield who didn't know he was coming. I had a stove. I had a roof. I had coffee already made, and I sent him out into the cold because I was tired. I have never once in 41 years let that light go out since. Anybody driving that road at any hour knows that as long as the light's on, somebody's awake, and the door will open, and they'll get fed, and nobody will ask them a single question they don't want to answer. That's all it ever was, Della. A light in a window so the next Earl Coombs doesn't walk off into the dark. Della set the pages down in her lap. She was crying now, the way she had not let herself cry in over a year, and she did not try to stop it. The diner was cold and dim around her, and it smelled of her father, of grease and sugar and coffee and the 14 years of him. And she sat on the floor of the room where he had hidden the truth of his life, and she read the rest of his handwriting. The handwriting of a man she had thought she'd known. A man who went to work and came home tired. A man she had never once thought to ask what tired him out. The salvage company opened at 9. By 9:15, Della was still on the pantry floor, surrounded by everything her father had kept hidden from the people who loved him, reading about strangers whose names she would spend the rest of her life learning. She did not call the salvage company. She did not call anyone. She sat in the building her brother had called a liability, and for the first time in 14 months she felt something other than the flat gray nothing she had been calling peace. The 4th ledger was the oldest, its cloth gone nearly black. The spine held with a rubber band that snapped to powder when she touched it. The first entry was dated 40 years ago, a year after the diner opened, the year after Earl Coombs walked off into the dark. October 9th. Kept the light on tonight. A boy came, maybe 17, run off from somewhere, wouldn't say where. Fed him eggs and let him sleep in the corner booth till the sun came up. Wouldn't take money for the bus, so I left it tucked in his jacket pocket while he slept. Eleanor doesn't know I do this. She'd worry, but I can't run that road in my head anymore, the one where I send them off, so I keep the light on. Eleanor was Della's mother, gone now 16s from a stroke in the same kitchen where Walt would later die. Either she had known all of it and kept his secret, or he had carried it alone for half a century. Della was not sure which was harder to hold. She kept reading, page after page, and the entries told a town she had grown up in and never seen. A woman whose husband hit her, who came to the diner on the bad nights and sat in booth 6 because Walt had quietly made it the one booth you could see from the road, so she always knew if his truck was in the lot. He gave her coffee and a place to be until it was safe, and he never once told her she should leave, because he had learned that telling people what to do only sent them back into the dark. A man just out of prison whom nobody in town would hire, whom Walt fed every morning for 2 months, and then without a word recommended to Gus across the road, who put him on at the hardware store, where he still worked. A family burned out of their house in the spring who ate every meal at the diner for 3 weeks, free, while Walt told them their money was no good until they were back on their feet and then took exactly nothing when they tried to pay. Each entry the same shape, date, the person, what they needed, what he did, no judgment, no sermon, no record of what was owed. He was not keeping books to collect. He was keeping books so that someone, someday, would know the people had been real. She picked up the bundle of letters, and the twine fell apart in her hands. The envelopes scattered, and she picked up the nearest. Lined notebook paper, folded small, the writing slow and careful, each letter drawn on its own. Dear Mr. Walt, you fed my family the winter my husband lost his job at the plant. You never made us feel like we were taking anything. You said the food would just go bad otherwise, but I saw you cook it fresh. My children are grown now. My oldest is a nurse. I tell them about the man at the diner who kept the light on. Thank you. The next was typed on plain paper. Mr. Hargrove, you probably don't remember me. I came through 11 years ago in bad shape, ready to do something I can't write down here, and I stopped at a diner because the light was on and I didn't want to die hungry. You fed me and you talked to me about nothing at all for 2 hours and you never asked what was wrong. And somewhere in there I decided to keep going. I'm writing to tell you I'm still here. That mattered. Another 3 lines on the back of a feed store receipt. You let me sit in that booth every Tuesday for 2 years after my wife passed. Nobody else did. I don't have the words. Thank you. And one in a child's careful print with a crayon drawing below it of a little brick building and a yellow square of light. Mr. Walt, your soup made my mom better. Thank you. Della read 11 letters and then she stopped, because she could not read anymore. She sat with her hands folded in her lap and the morning light shifting through the cracked window from gray to a thin pale gold. Across the road in the hardware store, the light was still on, and she could hear faintly somebody moving something heavy. Inside the diner, nothing moved at all. She found the paragraph in the letter she kept coming back to. The building's mine, Della. Paid cash, 11 years back, the day I had enough saved that no landlord could ever close us down. I put it in a trust so your brother can't sell it out from under what it's for. Cole's a good man in his way, but he measures everything in dollars and thinks that's the same as worth. And someday I hope he learns the difference, though I won't be there to see it. The money in the bank and the money in the can are for one thing only: keeping the light on and keeping the next person fed. I'm asking you to keep it going. I know you lost your restaurant. Cole told me a little. I know you blame yourself for more than the restaurant too, and I won't pretend to understand all of it. But I know what it is to carry a man you couldn't save. I've carried Earl Coombs for 41 years. The trick isn't to set him down. The trick is to keep cooking while you carry him. Keep the light on, Della. That's all I ever figured out that was worth anything. She folded the pages and held them against her chest. Through the window, the light over Renner Hardware finally went off, and a moment later, the door of the store opened, and a man came out, wiping his hands on a rag, and started across Route 9 toward the diner, looking at her car and then at the dark windows behind it. He was somewhere in his 60s, stocky, in a canvas work coat, and he walked with the particular care of a man whose knees have started to argue with him. Della watched him come. She did not move to open the door. He reached it anyway and stood looking through the cracked glass, and when a houser sitting on the pantry floor with the ledgers spread around her, his face changed. He let himself in. The bell gave its dull note. You're Della, he said. It was not a question. Walt's girl. You've got his stubborn around the eyes. How did you know him? The man stopped a few feet away and looked at the ledgers on the floor, then at her face, and his own face went quiet and careful. Gus Renner. I run the hardware across the road. Your daddy and I go back 40 years. He looked at the open box in the pantry floor, the lifted panel, and he let out a long breath through his nose. So you found it, he said. I always wondered who would. You knew about this. I knew some. Not all. Nobody knew all of it but Walt. He pulled a chair from the nearest table, turned it around and sat, his arms folded over the back. Your father saved my life, he said. You ought to know that first, before anything else. 22 years ago, I choked on a piece of steak right there at that counter, second stool from the end. Whole place watching me turn blue. Walt came around that counter faster than I'd ever seen him move, got his arms under my ribs, and brought it up. I was on the floor a full minute getting my breath. He never made a thing of it. Poured me a fresh coffee and told me to chew next time. Gus shook his head slowly. After that, I started watching the place, couldn't help it. and I started to see what he was really doing out here. Tell me, Della said. So he told her. How the regulars all knew Walt was an easy touch, but none of them knew the size of it. How Walt would do the dinner rush like any other diner, and then, after close, he'd flip the sign to close but leave the light burning in the window, and that was the signal. The truckers knew it. The drifters knew it. The cocha knew it without ever saying so. As long as the light was on, you could knock on that door at any hour and Walt would let you in and feed you and ask you nothing. How he kept the jar, the coffee can, where regulars who knew the secret would drop their change so the next person could eat. How he'd taken in men just out of jail and quietly walked them across the road to Gus for work. How for the last 11 years, since his hands got bad, Gus had been the one keeping the pilot light lit and the pipes from bursting, and this past year, leaving a lamp burning in that front window every single night because he could not stand to be the man who let Walt's light go out. He told me once. Gus said, the worst part of the work wasn't the cooking. It was after. He'd feed somebody in trouble at 2 in the morning and watch their taillights go up the road, and the rest of the night he'd lie awake wondering if they made it where they were going. Because there wasn't anywhere else for them to go once they left here. He was it. The whole net, just one tired man and a light in a window. Della closed the ledger in her lap. Her phone buzzed in her coat pocket. She pulled it out. Cole. Hey, her brother said, and his voice had the flat official tone he used when he was about to be reasonable at her. I got a piece of Dad's forwarded mail today. Tax notice on a commercial property out on Route 9. Says it's deeded to him. You know anything about that? It's the diner. That's my point. It was supposed to be in the estate valuation. If Dad was sitting on real property nobody disclosed, that changes the split. You already split it, Cole. I split what I knew about. If he was hiding assets, that's a different situation. A pause. There's something else. I got a call this morning from a development company. They're putting an interchange in out there, off the new bypass. They want that corner. The lot Dad's diner is on. They offered $310,000, Della. She did not say anything for a moment. Gus watched her face and went very still. You hear me? Cole said, 310, for a building we were about to give away for scrap. It's not for sale, Della said. Of course it's for sale. It's a closed diner with a tarp on the roof. What else would it be? It's a trust, she said, held for what Dad wanted it held for. You can call his lawyers, Brandt and Cho. The line went quiet. When Cole spoke again, the reasonable tone was gone. What kind of trust, he said. Dad made 41 years of grilled cheese. He didn't set up trusts. Della, listen to me. Toward the end, he wasn't thinking straight. Secret bank accounts, buying buildings, hiding deeds under the floor. None of that's rational. We need to get an attorney to look at this before you go signing anything. You took the house in 9 days, Della said. You had an agent measuring rooms while the funeral flowers were still on the table. You kept the savings. You kept the truck. You sold his tools to a stranger. You handed me a building you called a liability and 3 boxes you called junk, and now there's $300,000 on the table, and suddenly you care what happens to it. She kept her voice level. It was a voice she had not used in 14 months. The kitchen voice, the one she used when a line was on fire and somebody's had to stop panicking and start thinking. What else do you want, Cole? He didn't answer right away. She could hear him breathing. We're not done with this, he said. No, Della said. We're not. And she's hung up, and her hand was steady, and she sat there in the cold diner, holding her father's letter while Gus Renner watched her with something on his face that took her a moment to recognize as relief. He picked right, Gus said quietly. Daddy, he picked right. If you're still riding with Della, do me a favor and subscribe, because what these people did when the developer came back is the part of this story I've been waiting the whole time to tell you. Della did not drive back to the city that night. She slept in the apartment Walt had kept above the diner, the one she hadn't known existed until Gus showed her the narrow stair behind the kitchen. The bed made up with clean sheets, a lamp burning low in the window because Gus had not let it go dark in over a year. She lay awake a long time listening to the trucks on Route 9 and watching the square of light reflected on the ceiling, and she thought about Earl Coombs, 51, sitting down against a fence post in the cold because a tired young man told him to come back at 6. In the morning, Gus brought her coffee from the hardware store and a woman she didn't know. Pearl Dunmore was past 70, silver-haired, with reading glasses on a chain and the upright bearing of someone who had been in charge of something for a very long time. She had waited tables at the Lantern for 31 years, and she now ran the kitchen at the Methodist church in town. When she walked into the diner, she stopped in the doorway and put a hand to her mouth and stood there a moment before she could come in. "I've been wondering," she said, "which one of you would show up. I hoped it'd be you." She crossed the room, took Della's face in both hands, and looked at her hard. "I knew you when you were 6 years old, standing on a milk crate folding napkins. You've got your mother's mouth and your father's eyes. He talked about you more than you'd ever believe." "You knew," Della said, "about the light, the jar, all of it." "Honey, I knew all of it." Pearl sat down across from her in booth 6 like she'd done it 10,000 times, which she had. "I worked the dinner shift here for 31 years. I'd flip the sign to closed, and your daddy would say, 'Leave the light, Pearl,' and I knew what that meant. Plenty of nights I stayed and cooked alongside him for somebody who'd come knocking. We fed a woman in labor once, right there at the counter, while we waited for the ambulance that was 40 minutes out. We fed men I was scared of and men I wanted to take home and feed forever. We never turned one person away. Not one, in 31 years. How many?" Della said, "over all that time?" Pearl looked out the cracked window at the road. "I couldn't begin to count. Some nights nobody came, some nights 3 did. You take that times 41 years. She shook her head. "Your father used to say he wasn't running a charity. He hated that word. He said he was just running a diner that happened to never close all the way. Said a charity makes you feel small for needing it, and the whole point was that nobody who walked in here ever had to feel small. They just had to be hungry. And everybody's hungry sometimes." She got up and went to the wall by the register, where a corkboard hung that Della had not looked at closely. It was layered with photographs, years of them, church suppers and Christmas drives and customers mugging for the camera. Pearl pointed to one near the top. A crowded counter, a winter morning by the Coates. In the background, not looking at the camera, Walt stood at the flat top with a spatula, his head bent, working. "He's in the background of every picture anybody ever took in here," Pearl said. 40 years, and I don't think he's looking at the camera in a single one. He'd never stand still for it, always feeding somebody." She moved her finger to another photo, a Thanksgiving, every table full, Walt in the back carrying a tray. And another, a flood year, Walt loading boxes of food into the bed of a stranger's truck. "Some men build statues of themselves," Pearl said. "Your father built a habit in a whole town and never put his name on any of it. That's harder. And it lasts longer." While they talked, people came, not for food, for Della. Word had gone around town overnight, the way it does in places like Hartwell, that Walt Hargrove's daughter was out at the diner asking questions, and so they came. A woman in her 30s came first, holding a boy by the hand. She'd heard, she said, and she'd had to come. 12 years ago, she was 19 and pregnant, and her water broke on Route 9 in an ice storm with the hospital 40 minutes out, and her car in a ditch. She'd seen the light in the diner window and walked the last quarter mile holding her belly. Walt and Pearl had laid her down in booth 6 and delivered her son onto a stack of clean tablecloths and kept them both warm and alive until the ambulance came. The boy was healthy and tall and bored, tugging at his mother's sleeve. "He was the first 10 minutes, the woman said, and her eyes filled. "Your father was the first 10 minutes. After her came an old man who said Walt had let him sit in this diner every Tuesday for 2 years after his wife died, no charge, just so he'd have a reason to put his pants on. After him, a man Della's own age, who said quietly that he'd come through 11 years ago, meaning to drive his car off the bluff on the county line, and the only reason he hadn't was that he'd stopped at a lit-up diner first because he didn't want to die hungry. And the old man behind the counter had talked to him about absolutely nothing for 2 hours, and somewhere in there he'd decided to keep going. He had a wife now, he said. 2 kids. He never knew what he did, the man said. I wrote him a letter once. Never signed it. I was too ashamed of where I'd been. Della thought of the typed letter in the bundle unsigned, and she said nothing. But she reached across and put her hand on his arm. A retired schoolteacher came in the late afternoon, a woman named Margaret who had taught 3rd grade in town for 30 years. She did not have a dramatic story, she said, and she was almost apologetic about it. She had only been a widow with a small pension and a long winter, and Walt had noticed, the way he noticed, that she'd started ordering just coffee and a side of toast and calling it lunch. After that, her plate always came out fuller than she ordered. An egg she hadn't asked for, a second piece of pie wrapped to go that she hadn't paid for, and when she tried to correct the bill, he'd wave her off and say the cook made a mistake. Take it. You'd be doing him a favor. He let me keep my dignity while he fed me, Margaret said. That's the rarest kindness there is. Anybody can give a person food. Almost nobody can do it without making them feel poor. She set a folded 20 in the coffee can on her way out, the way she said she'd been doing for years, ever since she'd figured out what the can was for. If you've stayed with Della this long, hit subscribe. Because the man who tried to take all of this away from her is about to walk into that diner, and what he carried in his pocket is the part of this story I've been waiting to tell you. She did not sleep much that second night either, but it was a different kind of not sleeping. The next morning she called Gus and said 3 words she had not said to anyone in 14 months. I need help. Gus said, course you do, and hung up, and 40 minutes later his truck pulled into the lot with a ladder and 2 younger men and his grandson. The grandson was 19, named Theo, lean and quiet, with paint on his boots and a way of standing in a doorway as if he wasn't sure he was allowed in. He shook Della's hand and said almost nothing while the men assessed the roof, but she caught him reading the chalkboard, the pot roast, cornbread, and fat you need, and frowning at that last word the same way she had. My grandpa told me what this place was, Theo said to her low when the others had gone up the ladder. What your dad did. I didn't believe him. People don't do that for 40 years. He looked at the corner booth, at the corkboard, at the open box still sitting in the pantry floor. He told me something else too. That when I was a baby, the winter my mom got left with nothing, somebody around here kept us in groceries the whole season. She'd find boxes on the step, bread, formula, canned stuff, she never knew who. Grandpa told me last night it was Walt. That your dad fed me before I could even eat solid food, and I never knew his name. He said it plainly, still working it out in his own mind the way a person looks at a story he thought was his and finds someone else standing in it. I want to help. Whatever you're doing here. I want to be part of it. We need all the hands we can get, Della said, and Theo nodded once, like a thing had been settled that he'd been waiting his whole life to settle. They got to work. Gus's crew patched the roof and tore off the tarp that had been up so long the brick beneath it had gone green. The younger men ran new wiring to the kitchen and replaced the breaker box with a clean one, 60 amps, the wires labeled in marker. Theo took the front of the house, and he took it the way someone takes a thing he means to be good at. He scrubbed the vinyl booths and oiled the chrome stools. He cleaned the pie case glass until you could see the road through it. He sat for an hour with Pearl while she showed him how Walt had kept the coffee, the exact scoop, the splash of cold water on the grounds before the hot, the trick of it. And he learned it the way you learn a thing from someone who learned it from someone else, a chain of small knowledge running back through 40 years of mornings. Della took the kitchen, which was the only room in her life she had ever fully understood. She broke the range down to its bones. She pulled the burners and soaked them in a bucket of Detsy Greer she'd bought with $11 she could not spare. And she ran a wire brush along the seams of the flat top until her shoulder burned and the metal came up the dull silver it must have been the day her father bought it. She found, scratched into the underside of the prep table where no customer would ever see it, the initials W. H and a date from before she was born, and beside it, in a child's clumsy gouge, a crooked D she had no memory of making but knew at once was hers. She knelt there a long time with her thumb in the groove of that letter. Then she went back to scrubbing. Somewhere in the 3rd hour, on her knees with the brush and the smell of her father all around her, bacon fat and bleach and cold coffee, she stopped feeling like a person cleaning out a dead man's diner. She started feeling like a cook in a kitchen, which she had not let herself be in over a year. The labor was the kind that left her hands raw and her back wrecked and her head, for the first time in months, blessedly empty. She hauled 40 years of broken-down equipment to the dumpster Gus had rented. A dead freezer, a slicer with no blade, crates of mismatched china too chipped to use and too heavy with memory to throw away. So she kept those. She scraped the chalkboard clean and then could not bring herself to leave it blank. So she wrote her father's last menu back onto it in chalk, the pot roast and the cornbread, and the things she was only beginning to understand. She worked from the gray light before the trucks started running, until the gray light, after they stopped, and at night her body was too tired to keep her awake, which was its own kind of mercy. At night she read the ledgers. She had finished the newest too. She went back to the oldest, the black one, reading the early entries she'd skimmed, finding names that matched the people now walking through the door, dates that lined up with the stories Pearl told. And then, near the back of the 3rd ledger, in ink darker than the rest, The handshake year, an entry added late, dated 14 months ago, she found herself. Della called tonight, it read. She sounded like the bottom had gone out of her. She lost the restaurant. She didn't say it straight, she never says anything straight, but I could hear it in the way she talked around it. She's blaming herself. I know that sound, I made it myself, the year I sent Earl Coombs off into the cold. She thinks she failed at the only thing she ever loved, and that it means something about who she is. It doesn't. Losing a thing you poured your whole self into isn't a verdict. It's just a Tuesday that went bad and kept going. She won't let me say any of that to her. She's too proud, like her mother, proud as a fence post in January. But she'll come back here someday, after I'm gone, and she'll find what I've been doing all these years, and maybe then she'll understand why a man keeps a light on, even when he's the only one who can see it. Maybe she'll keep it on too. I never could tell her I was proud of her without it coming out wrong. So I'm telling the book instead. I'm proud of her, I always was, and I'm sorry I was no good at saying it out loud while I still had a voice to say it with. Della set the ledger down on the counter and pressed her hands flat against it, the way her father used to. She had never told him about Marrow. She'd told the bank, the lawyers, the 11 employees she sent home. She had never called her father to say the words "I failed," because she could not stand the thought of him knowing his daughter had lost the thing she'd traded him away for. But he had known. He'd heard it in 2 minutes on the phone, the way a father hears the thing his child is hiding. And he had not pushed, and he had not lectured, and he had not offered advice she wasn't ready for. He had written it down in a book she was only ever meant to find if she came looking, and he had said the one thing she had spent her whole adult life waiting to hear, and had stopped believing she would. She cried then, and it was not the quiet kind. It came up from somewhere she'd kept sealed for years, and she cried for her father and for the visits she hadn't made, and for the birthday she'd skipped for a dining room full of strangers, and a restaurant that died anyway, and she cried for the 2 years of phone calls she'd cut short, because she was too ashamed to talk to the one man who would never have judged her. And she sat at her father's counter under his last chalkboard and let it all come through her and out, and when it was done she felt scraped clean, the way a pan feels when you've finally gotten to the metal. The lawyer's letter from Cole's attorney came that Friday. It challenged the trust on the grounds of diminished capacity, citing Walt's secretive financial conduct, his hidden accounts, his concealment of property from his own family, as evidence that he had not been of sound mind. Della read it standing at the reception counter and set it down without a word. Gus, on the roof, saw her face through the cleaned-up front window and came down the ladder. He's saying Dad was crazy, she said, to break the trust, to take the land for the developer. Gus went to his truck and came back with a cardboard box. Inside were the work orders, 11 years of them, every time he'd serviced the diner's boiler, or its pipes, or its wiring, each one with a note from Walt in the corner about something else he wanted done next, everyone in clear, exact handwriting, everyone signed and dated. He wrote these himself, Gus said. Every line, sharp as a tack right up to the last one. You bring these to whatever they hold. And Pearl's got the church records, and there's 100 people in this town who sat across a counter from that man last year and watched him remember their kids' names. They want to call him crazy. They're going to have to do it to a full room. The hearing was held on a Tuesday afternoon in the county courthouse in town, not a trial, only a review, requested by Cole's lawyer, to decide whether the trust should be opened. But the day before the hearing, Della's phone rang with a number she didn't know, and a woman's voice, calm and professional, introduced herself as Okafor from Brandt and Cho, her father's attorneys. She had heard about the challenge. She wanted Della to understand exactly what her father had built before she walked into that courtroom. Your father came to our office 8 years ago, Okafor said, and set up an irrevocable trust. You are the sole trustee. The property and the funds are designated for one purpose, the provision of free meals to anyone in need, in perpetuity. He chose that word himself, perpetuity. He wanted it to outlive all of us. The trust cannot be sold, dissolved, or redirected, and it was drafted from the start to withstand exactly the kind of capacity challenge your brother is bringing. Your father anticipated this. He told me a son who measures things in dollars would come along eventually, and he wanted the door bolted before that day arrived. A pause. He came back to our office every year for 8 years to review the terms. His last visit was 9 weeks before he died. He was lucid, specific, and very clear about what he wanted. He also left a note in the file to be read to you if it ever came to this. What does it say? Della asked. It says she'll be ashamed when she finds it. Tell her shame is just love that lost its way home. Tell her to leave the light on and the shame will find its way back. Della closed her eyes and held the phone and did not say anything for a while, and Okafor, who had clearly read the file, did not rush her. The courthouse room was small, 2 tables at the front, 6 rows of chairs behind. Della sat at the left table beside Okafor, who had driven 2 hours to be there. Cole sat at the right table beside his own lawyer, Renee behind him with her coat still on, and the back rows, when Della turned to look, were full. The woman whose son had been born in booth 6, the boy beside her. The old man who'd sat there every Tuesday for 2 years. The man who'd been driving to the bluff 11 years ago. Margaret, the schoolteacher. Pearl upright, hands folded, Gus in a clean shirt. Theo beside him. 2 women from the church. People Della had met that week, and people she had not, who had heard what was happening and hence had simply come because they wanted to be in the room when somebody tried to call Walt Hargrove crazy. Cole's lawyer made his argument: secrecy, undisclosed assets, hidden deeds, a pattern, he said, of conduct inconsistent with a sound and rational mind. Okafor answered with the medical records first, the annual physicals, the last 10 weeks before Walt died, alert and oriented and fully competent. Then the work orders, then the church files, the deliveries logged in Walt's hand. Then she did a thing the law did not require, but the judge allowed. She let the room speak. The mother went first. She stood and told about the ice storm and the booth and her son's first 10 minutes of life. The man from the bluff stood and his voice shook, and he said, "This man kept me alive without ever knowing he did it, and a sane man did that. A sane does that for 41 years on purpose." The old man stood and said, "For 2 years after my wife died, your father gave me a reason to leave the house, and there was nothing wrong with his mind, the wrong was all in mine, and he fixed it a cup of coffee at a time." One after another they stood, and they did not talk about deeds or accounts or capacity. They talked about a man who kept a light on so they wouldn't walk off into the dark. And Cole sat through all of it, and he did not look at his lawyer or his wife, and he watched the faces of people standing up one after another to describe a father he had lived in the same house with, and somehow never met. The judge reviewed the evidence and dismissed the challenge inside of an hour. The trust was valid. Della was the sole trustee. The matter was closed. Cole's lawyer gathered his files. Renee was up and moving toward the door with her keys already out. Cole stayed in his chair a moment longer, then stood and walked toward the back of the room, and he had to pass the whole row of people who had come for his father. He didn't stop, but as he came even with the end of Della's row, his steps slowed, and his eyes met hers, and his jaw was tight, and underneath the anger she saw something she had not seen on her brother's face before. A crack. The first hairline fracture in a certainty he had carried since the morning after the funeral. Then he pushed through the door and was gone. Spring came. The diner was a different building by then. New roof, the brick scrubbed down to red, the cracked front window finally replaced with clean glass that let the morning light pour across the floor. Theo had sanded and refinished the counter himself, and you could see the grain in it now, 41 years of elbows worn smooth and bright. Pearl had come back, not to wait tables, but to run the front of the house 2 days a week, because she said a person can only make so many church casseroles before they start to miss the road. Gus had built a new sign for the pole out front from a sheet of reclaimed barn tin, and it read in letters Theo had painted, "The Lantern," and below that, smaller open, "Lights on, everybody eats." Della renewed nothing official because there was nothing to renew, she just cooked. She studied the trust documents at the counter at night, Okafor's careful pages stacked beside her father's ledgers, and she learned how he'd built it to do exactly one thing forever. Keep the diner open and the light on, and the next person fed, with the money he'd saved $1 at a time funding the meals nobody paid for. She put the coffee can back where it had been, on the shelf by the register, with "For the Jar" written on a new strip of tape, and people started dropping their change in it again the way they had for 40 years, as if it had never stopped. The morning she reopened was warm and clear. Gus came before 7 to check the new water lines one last time. Pearl came with a coffee urn and an argument about how Walt would have wanted the cornbread done. Theo was already inside in a clean apron, running through a supply list he'd written himself, working the front like he'd been born to it, which in a way he had. By 9 the dining room had people in it, and most of them had not come to eat. The mother and her tall, bored son. The old man from booth 6. The man from the bluff with his wife and his 2 kids. Gus's crew in for coffee on the way to a job. They had come because the place existed again. And they wanted to be there when the light came back on. Della stood behind the counter in her father's apron, which she had found on its hook by the kitchen door, and which fit her, and she looked out at the room and felt something in her chest that had been clenched for over a year slowly let go. Then Cole walked in. He stood in the doorway with his hands at his sides, no tie, no Renee. He looked at the booths and the counter and the framed photograph of young Walt by the door, and at the chalkboard where Della had written, that morning in her own hand, the same words her father had left. Today, pot roast cornbread, and water you need. The room went quiet. Della came out from behind the counter. Can we talk? Cole said. She walked past him out the front door and he followed, and they stopped on the gravel by the sign with the morning sun warm on the new red brick. I sat in that hearing, Cole said. He was looking at the building, not at her. I listened to all of them. Every single one. And about halfway through I figured out something I should have known 40 years ago. His voice was steady, but the steadiness was costing him everything. I didn't know him. I thought I did. I knew a man who got up at 4 and came home smelling like grease and fell asleep in his chair, and I spent my whole life a little embarrassed by it, by the diner, by how small it all was. I never once asked what tired him out. It never occurred to me there was anything to ask. Della leaned against the signpost and waited. She had learned that from the ledgers. You let people get there themselves. He kept it from us because he knew exactly what I'd have said. Cole almost laughed, but it didn't make it all the way out. I'd have called it a waste. A man giving away food for free in the middle of the night to people who'd never pay him back. I'd have told him to wise up. He was right not to tell me. He reached into his jacket and took out a white envelope and held it out. The house sold for $171. My share, after the mortgage and the costs, came to about $22,000. That's half, $11,000 it's made out to the trust. Della took it. It's not enough, Cole said. I know it isn't. For 30 years of it, but it's a start. She looked at the check and then at her brother. He was not the man who had dropped a ring of keys on the kitchen counter and called the diner a liability. He was not entirely a different man either. He was a man standing in a gravel lot, trying to do a thing he had no practice at, and it was costing him every ounce of the certainty he usually carried like armor. Okay, she said. Okay, he said, and he didn't try to hug her, and she didn't reach for him, and that would come later, or it wouldn't, but he was here, and for now that was enough. He walked to his car, and this time, when he pulled out onto Route 9 and turned toward town, Della did not wonder whether he was coming back. Inside, the dining room had settled into a warm hum. Pearl was telling Gus he'd cut the cornbread wrong. Theo was refilling the jar from his own pocket when he thought no one was looking. The bell over the door gave its dull note, and Della turned, and a woman came in carrying a small girl on her hip. The woman was maybe 25, in a thin coat too light for the morning, and she had the wide, tired eyes of someone who had been driving since before dawn, with nowhere in particular to drive to. The little girl's cheeks were flushed and damp. "Is this the place?" the woman said. "A lady at the gas station in town told me. She said you don't turn people away. She said the light's always on." "That's right," Della said. "Come on in. Sit anywhere. Booth in the corner's the best one." She brought them to booth 6, the one you could see from the road, the one where a baby had been born and a frightened woman had once watched for a truck in the lot, the one her father had made the safest seat in the building 40 years before either of them was born. "How long since she's eaten?" Della asked. "Last night. I've got a little money I can." "You don't need it here," Della said. "That's not how this place works. You just have to be hungry, and everybody's hungry sometimes." She went into the kitchen, her father's kitchen, her kitchen now, and she washed her hands at the sink, and she took down a pan and set it on the flat top, and for the first time in 14 months, she cooked a meal for a stranger who could not pay her, and her hands were not strange to her at all. She made the girl a grilled cheese, cut on the diagonal the way her father had cut hers, when she was small enough to stand on a milk crate. She made the mother eggs, and bacon and toast and coffee, and she carried the plates out herself and set them down in booths. And she watched if the woman's shoulders come down from around her ears at the simple fact of food set in front of her with no bill behind it. "Thank you," the woman said, and her eyes filled. "I didn't know where else to go." "You're in the right place," Della said. "Eat, and if you're still around it close, the light stays on. Nobody's putting you back on that road in the dark." Late that afternoon, with the lunch rush long over and Pearl gone home, and Theo wiping down the booth and Gus crossed the lawn up the hardware store, Della stood alone behind the counter and watched the light go gold and then gray on Route 9. She went into the pantry and lifted the panel in the floor and looked into the steel box. Empty now. The ledgers were on the shelf above the register where anyone could read them. The letters were in a frame on the wall by the corkboard. The deed was filed with the trust, the passbook at the bank, the jar full and on the counter where it belonged. Everything Walt had sealed under the floor in the dark was up in the light now, turned into a roof and a window and a sign that said, "Everybody eats." She closed the panel. She walked to the front of the diner as the day went out, and she reached up and switched on the lamp. In the window, the one Gus had refused to let go dark for over a year, the one her father had kept burning every night for 41 years, so that no one driving that road at any hour would ever have to walk off into the cold the way Earl Coombs had walked, 51 years old, on his way to a brother who didn't know he was coming. Walt Hargrove had spent his whole life feeding the people nobody else fed, asking nothing, telling no one, keeping a single light on against the dark. And when he could not do it anymore, he hid the truth of it under the floor of his own pantry, and trusted that the daughter who'd lost her way would find it, and find herself in it, and keep the light on after he was gone. Della stood at the window beside the burning lamp, and looked out at the empty highway running off into the dusk in both directions. Somewhere out there, tonight or tomorrow night or the night after, somebody cold and hungry and out of road would come around the bend and see a small brick building with a yellow square of light in the window, and they would know, the way the whole county had known for half a century, that as long as that light was on, somebody was awake, and the door would open, and they would be fed. And no one would ask them a single thing. She left the light on. There was work to do in the morning, and the morning after that, and every morning after for as long as she had hands to do it. She was ready.